All right, so my name is Christian Potvin, and I'm going to give a talk that's very similar to Mike's, except that mine, I took a different career, different path to the career that I now have. So the title that I gave was Navigating Your Way to a Career in Making Games, Tips on How to Make It There. It was very early on. It's quite a mouthful, but I stuck with it, and so here we go. I figure the best place to start is to give you a bit of history about myself. I too basically grew up in Ottawa. I lived my whole life out here, and I, in all likelihood, intend to stay. It's my home, and I'm very comfortable here. And then a few years back, in 2009, I started thinking about a career in games. It took me a while to take the leap because I was earning a fair bit of money, and that is something that holds you back, unfortunately. Is once you start making money, it's very difficult to pull yourself away from that. So, but you have to decide at some point if it's what's more important to you. And I decided that what was important to me is to try stuff. And one of the things I'd always wanted to try was to make games. So I gave a lot of thought as to what I would do to go and make games, and I ultimately settled on taking, I guess, what some people would consider a more traditional path, which is to go to school. And I went to Algonquin College. And Algonquin College, as some of you may know, offers a program called game development. So it's very specific to games. There's a lot of other programs out there, a lot of other options, but this is the one I chose because I felt that for myself, I wanted to be immersed in a situation where I would constantly be creating, or at least that was the idea. The other thing that I put on the slide to point out is that I started out in 2012. I was 27 years old. So I put that out there because that was something that I was considering as maybe something that would hold me back starting in the industry so late. But it's been my experience, and if there's anybody out there in this audience right now that's considering this that might be a hindrance, it's really not. I mean, if you want to do anything in life, it's out there, it's available to you. You just need to dedicate yourself to it and go for it. And age is not an issue at all. So I landed my first job in 2014. I worked at Magmic here in Ottawa. While there, I worked on this game, Apples to Apples, for a while, and this was the first game that I had the opportunity to start and finish on, beginning to end, which was really cool. It's a pretty neat experience when you're able to start and finish something as opposed to just come in somewhere in the middle. And I was actually really proud of this particular game. I also had a brief stint over the last summer at Fuel, which is another company here in Ottawa. And while I was working at Fuel, I got to work on a game for the NFL, NFL Rush Game Day, where I was the lead developer on everything that had to do with the games. It was me and another resource, and we were hoping for other resources to assist in completing the project, but that didn't materialize, so I ended up doing pretty much the entire game. And it was pretty cool. It connects to the NFL's APIs, and the idea is that while your kid is playing this game, and live data is coming in from the NFL about who scored a touchdown, from what yardage, and we take these data points and dynamically create a challenge for the kid to play that mimics what's taken place in the game. But since then, I've moved on. I've now moved over to work for UI, which isn't a game company; it's a software company, and they've been quite good to me. I'm enjoying working there. So I guess in a sense, I've moved away from games, but I wouldn't say I'm done with them professionally, that's for sure. I really enjoy working in the game industry. It was the right move for me at the time. So that gives you a sense of who I am and what sort of background I have. So I'll just go over the agenda that I had in mind. I mean, this is really about just giving some very general tips. The way I approached this talk was to try to put out there tips that I wish I had had access to, basically a talk that I wish I would have had access to when I started 5 years ago. There's a lot of stuff that you learn from talking to people. A lot of the same stuff comes up over and over again, and I'm hoping that I can relay that back to you. Maybe you've already heard it in the past before, but I'm also open to throw in some stories to back that up as much as I can. And I also have a bit of general advice to offer. So the first tip, it's a very simple tip, and it's to start now. It might sound obvious, but you really just have to start. I mean, if you want to make games, you have to just pick something up and begin. One of the best reasons to do this is because you may not. It might sound silly, but you may not like doing it at all. And it's very important for you to try to do something, anything that you think you might be interested in, to find out if you actually are. And beyond that, there are tons of engines available for you to use right now. I mean, obviously this is an OUUG meetup, but But there are other engines out there as well. But specifically to Unity, the Unity engine is the engine that I have the most experience with, and I've worked professionally using Unity. And one of the reasons it's such a good engine is because it's very, very accessible. I think Mike did a very good job of pointing out how you can pick up Unity from knowing nothing. And a lot of what makes Unity accessible, especially if you have a bit of a programming background, is among other things, is the documentation is very solid. So anytime that you have some documentation that can really help you learn the engine quickly, you can very quickly move on from just being a novice to creating interesting things that are original and interesting. Also the forums. The forums are fantastic. There's a huge online community. If there's anything that you can't figure out through using the documentation, you can ask someone on Unity, and Byron Main's on there all the time. It's a great resource for you to use to find out things that aren't easily found out otherwise. So my second tip ties in a lot with the first tip, and it's basically to start small. It's very important to not take on too much to start. And it also, depending on how you're approaching this, you may have an idea, you may not have an idea. So the first thing I'll bring up is maybe some initial project ideas when you're not sure, when you're just learning what to do. And the best piece of advice I give you there is just to clone something. One of the reasons it's very good to approach learning a new engine by cloning something that already exists is the rules are already there for you. Everyone understands how Pong works. Everyone understands how Breakout works. These are all very simple games that we've played in the past, and there's even some contemporary examples such as Flappy Bird, which is well within the reach of a novice developer. And if you take any of these on, you can start to learn Unity. So by limiting what you're trying to go for, by not having to worry too much about the type of game you're creating and understanding the rules and the design, it's already been set forth for you. It's already very clear. You can just focus on learning the engine and realizing the vision that's already there for you. So that's a good way to start if you don't know what to begin with. But a lot of people have original ideas, and original ideas are great. You should definitely pursue them. The important thing that I try to do whenever I have some ideas that I think I might want to pursue is to write them down. It's very easy to forget something. It's very easy for a little inspiration to hit you and then to lose that if you don't write it down. So it sounds like a very, very basic tip, but write these things down, keep track of them. Ideas are yours. They only belong to you, and unless you capture them in some way or you return to them, they'll just disappear and they'll be gone, and that's it. And that's something that I think a lot of people take for granted. A lot of ideas are naturally going to be a lot bigger, so the advice I would give to that is to look at the idea and break it down. Every big project, every big professional project is not tackled at one big chunk all at once. You break it down and you complete little pieces of it, and you eventually get the finished product. It's no different for any idea that you might want to take on yourself. And there's value in figuring out how to break your game apart into smaller pieces because it allows you to prototype it. I know I'm repeating what Mike said in the previous presentation, but prototyping is very important because no matter how great your idea might seem, it might actually be quite terrible, and it's incumbent on you to try out your idea, to see what works, see what doesn't work, see if there's something interesting there. And you're also doing yourself a favor if you come across something that just doesn't work, and then you can just decide to toss it and move on to the next thing. But constantly prototyping your ideas is a good idea. And before moving on to the next tip, I just want to hammer home this idea that, I'm just saying the word idea quite a bit. Ideas remain ideas forever unless you bring them into the world. There really are something that belongs to you uniquely. So it's very important that if you have something that you want to create, that you want to put out there, it's 100% on you. Your ideas will disappear if you don't try to see if there's something there. So again, just start small, but definitely just start. It doesn't matter where you start, just start. That's actually something that I wish I'd done more of before going into games. I spent a lot of time before going into college learning some programming languages, but I didn't spend as much time as I should have trying to actually do games with the programming languages. But I mean, with Unity, it's very easy to get started, and I encourage you to do so if you are considering starting a career in games. The next tip, game jams. Game jams are fantastic. Game jams teach you a lot and allow you to create something in a very short amount of time. Generally speaking, not all the time, of course, you'll come out with some sort of completed product, and any completed product, any little game that you can finish, can be used as a portfolio piece down the road if you're slowly building yourself up to hopefully find a job in games. So the more game jams you participate, the more potential for completed products. But at the same time, even if you end up with something that is completely broken or incomplete, I would encourage you to take the time to finish it. It does usually, in my experience with certain games that haven't exactly been executed as well upon as I would have liked during a game jam, there isn't that much work left to finish them off. It might be discouraging to come up short, but it's usually worth it to just push through to the end and finish it and see what you end up with. In terms of benefits that game jams can give you in a professional setting, one thing that game jams do is they restrict the amount of time that you can do something in. And with the prevalence of agile development in pretty much every job that I've worked at, it's very important for a developer to be able to accurately estimate what they are capable of completing within a certain period of time. That's how it works. You're responsible for your estimates. So the more game jams you participate in, the more you become adept at gauging what you're capable of, and the better you become at being able to estimate your work accurately when you do take on a professional role somewhere. So I'll briefly zip through here. So we've already gone through these in the previous presentations, but there's two types of game jams as I would categorize them in two types. There's game jams where you actually attend a location, you participate with people. Those are awesome. OJAM is an example of that. There's also the Global Game Jam. If you aren't aware, it's happening this weekend, starting on Friday. Cool story about my first Global Game Jam. It was in 2014, and it was the first time I ever used Unity. I was in school, and we were about to start learning Unity in school, but I hadn't reached that point yet, and I just said, let's do this. And I just dived right in. So the people at game jams are generally just wonderful, very welcoming, warm people who are just excited to be making games. And if you're interested in finding a team to participate in, or even if you're not interested in participating, you just want to watch and see how it's done, I highly recommend that you attend a game jam like the Global Game Jam that's happening next weekend. It's a great opportunity to learn again, and learning is really the key here. The other type of jams are the ones I call the online jams. Sometimes there are events that are organized where you can meet up, but Ludum Dare is an example of a game jam that I've participated in a few times. They have lots of events throughout the year. They have some tentpole events. I think it's every 4 months, if I'm not mistaken. And typically what I would do when I would participate in these game jams is I would bring in some friends. We'd all stay at my house for the weekend and we'd create something, and it was a great time. So tip number 4, you're already doing it, you're here. Attending industry events is very important. Attending industry events allows you to learn again. When you go to these events, you meet people, you can start conversing about the craft, about the thing that you love to do. You can talk about your games, you can show off your stuff, and you just meet all sorts of interesting people. You can attend all sorts of talks as well. If you go to any of the big events, the big conferences, there's multiple tracks, and there's definitely something for you to do at every time slot that you would find interesting. And regardless if you bomb on a couple of them, sometimes they don't live up to the expectations, you usually end up coming away having watched a couple presentations that you really enjoyed and that you really took something out of, and you can be inspired by that as well. So it's a great way to make contacts, great way to meet people, and it's just a great way to learn. So I highly recommend that you do that as well. I'll go through these very quickly because we've already gone through some of these. In Montreal, we have the MIGs, GDCs all over the world, and we have the Capital Gaming Expo, which is undergoing a refocus at this point. I'm very excited to see where it takes us. So, and of course, there's local groups. These are smaller events. We're at one right now. I'm sure most of you have heard of the Dirty Rectangles. They hold their events every third Wednesday of the month, and we're really focused on essentially celebrating game creation. And then the IGDA is pretty active here in Ottawa as well. They have events frequently. And these are all excellent opportunities for you to go out there, meet people, and learn. So there's another type of event that I used to attend frequently, especially when I was looking to get my first job. Magmic used to hold these recruitment events. And the story that I have with this is, so I really realized that this is basically the mindset that every person who's interviewing people basically has, is that you really have to distinguish yourself. And the best way you can distinguish yourself is by having something playable that you can put in their hand. And people had told me that numerous times, and I believed the advice and I executed on it, but I didn't realize how true that advice was until I actually did it, and I recommend that you do the same thing. So the story essentially is that these events usually use very quick interviews, like 5 minutes tops. It's a constant rotation of people coming in, signing up, sitting down, talking to someone. So I sat down with someone who worked at Magmic, an engineer who's been there a very long time, who I'd met before, who had brief conversations with in the past, who I thought I was at least acquainted with. I sat down, I introduced myself, I gave him my resume, and within the first few seconds of us talking, I handed him this game. This game is very simple. It looks quite nice, and I was actually really happy with it, but it's basically just a parallaxing background with pixel art. We had to do a parallaxing background assignment for school, but all I had to do was some sort of tiling background, but I was interested in pixel art. So I decided to try to paint some landscapes in pixel art, and it looked really sweet when I was moving around. So I'm like, all right, let's make a game out of this. So I threw a dragon in there, and it eats coins, and it flies around. It's super simple. You have your current score and the high score to beat, and it's super easy. And I put it on a phone, you just tap on it, and it goes up and down. And he played it for 10 seconds, and the first question he asked me after I played it was, what's your name again? So if that doesn't hammer home the idea that to everyone who is interviewing you in these large events is that you're just another person until you can really show them that you're able to create something, that you have that you can back up what you're saying with an actual product. And there's no better way to do that than to actually put something in someone's hand and have them play it, even if something is as simple as this. It really helps. So I actually credit this game as being one of the reasons I eventually managed to get my first job at Magmic in between my second and third year of school. So the next tip, continuously learn. You can never stop learning. Even if you decide to go to school, even after school ends, even in the summer, even after classes, just continually be learning. It's important to do this because, well, I'll get into that momentarily, but essentially just keep creating constantly, right? That's the best way to teach yourself, right? And when you're creating constantly, you're going to be reinforcing knowledge that you already have because you're just retreading certain things that are very common that you do frequently. And because you're constantly executing and creating new ideas, you're also going to be learning new things because hopefully you're not making the same game over and over again. Or if you're doing that, not for too long of a period of time. So have a goal and try to push yourself towards new directions. Use what you already know and learn new things to create even better things. And one of the things that you get from doing that that's very important is that you expand your knowledge. You have a wider breadth of knowledge, and in expanding that breadth of knowledge that you have in making games, you can start figuring out the things that you like to do. And that's very important because if you're not interested in what you're trying to learn, you're just not going to learn it. You have to go after things that are interesting, and in my experience, and I've tried to learn all sorts of things that I felt would be valuable to a career in game development. I've tackled things that I was less interested in. I've tackled things that I was super interested in. I've also tackled things that are super interesting to me that have nothing to do with games. And it's very obvious that you have to be interested in what you're trying to learn, or else you're just not going to get there. And this also ties back all the way back to the first point, which is you got to start. You got to start somewhere, and you have to just try it. And by trying it out, you'll figure it out, and you'll see if it's interesting to you or not. That's one of the biggest, going a little bit off what I planned, but it's one of the biggest issues I find with people who go to college or university right now, especially programs that are very specific to games, is they have no clue what they want to do. And unfortunately, they get there and they're disappointed. There's a lot of stuff you can do before taking that leap, before starting to invest that kind of money, if you want to invest that kind of money in a formal education, which may or may not be necessary. Definitely make sure you're going to get some value out of it, because a lot of people start and they don't finish, and they lose a lot of money going to school, and that's unfortunate. And one of the things you can do is to see if you're interested in it before you actually go after it. One quote that my first year teachers, I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the quotes that my teachers told me in the first year of school was my art teacher, and it had to do with, this is a very wide range of stuff that we'd have to do in these classes. Some of it useful, some of it less useful. We'd had to take an art class, and we had to draw drawings. And he said, that you have to draw 1,000 drawings before you get one that's like worth showing. And I feel that's very applicable to any sort of creative action, be it making music, making movies, or making games. The more games you make, the more you'll get those bad ones out of the way, and then eventually you'll hit on something that is interesting and generally worth pursuing, and you can keep pursuing it to its completion. So it all ties back to just continuously creating, continuously making stuff. And specifically with regards to failure, like there's this, I think less and less nowadays, but there's this conception that failure is a bad thing, and failure is a great thing. The more you fail, the more you learn. Assuming that you just don't let failure crush you and disappoint you, you should look at why you failed, understand it, and learn from it so that you don't fail that way again. So failure is a good thing, and should be embraced, and you'll definitely be embracing it by making a lot of stuff that's really bad. And the last, tip that I have at the moment is to share your knowledge. You can share your knowledge in a lot of different ways. I'm currently sharing my experiences and some of my knowledge from the last 5 years. Like I said, this is a talk that I wanted to when I was putting it together, this is the talk that I would have wanted to have when I was coming into the idea of going and doing games. There's also web forums, which is a great way to participate and learn. I mean, one of the biggest, so going back to the Unity forums, one thing that happens fairly frequently that I've noticed is that someone will ask a question, someone will provide some advice on how to solve the problem, and then the person will come back at the very end and say, oh, I managed to figure it out, but won't provide any context as to how they figured it out or what happened. So if you're going to ask questions, if you're going to try to get the community to help you, give back when you have your answer. I mean, just think about the next person who's coming along who's having the same problem that you're having, and all the frustrations you may have encountered in trying to solve that problem, and the benefit that you will have given them by doing something very simple like spending 5 minutes to add or finish off your post. Another very useful thing I found, especially, you get a lot of opportunities to do this when you're in the school system, is in terms of sharing your knowledge, you can tutor fellow students. And I'm not necessarily talking about signing up for some sort of tutoring job somewhere. You can do this very informally. It's quite natural in any school setting to have subjects at which you excel and subjects at which you're not as good. And what I've found is that you have to enjoy doing this, but even if you don't enjoy it, I would encourage you to do it. But teaching others is a good way to reinforce your knowledge, because it forces you to explain it to someone who doesn't understand it as well. And what that often does is it'll expose gaps in your knowledge that you weren't even aware were there. Because when you have to explain something from the very basic to the level at which you understand it, you'll reinforce what you understand, and you'll also be able to fill those gaps that you didn't even realize were there. So I have a few tips for programmers, I guess. I'll try to go through these quickly. These are just things that you should do, especially if you're trying to find a job, essentially, in games, because it's very useful to be able to put that on your resume, to be able to have an understanding before you jump in. It increases your productivity quite a bit. Having a sense of how version control works is good. There's a lot of different options out there. Schools will introduce you to it, but they do a very, very, very poor job of enforcing it or making sure you follow good practices or that you actually understand what the heck's going on. So there was a lot of learning on the job for me the first few times that basically when I started working, I had to actually learn how to use version control. Git is very commonly used. I'm not trying to single out saying, oh, Git's the best thing, but I've been using it for a lot of jobs, and this is a resource that I found was fairly fantastic. It's a book that basically is available for free online and goes through how Git works from A to Z on the command line. There's a lot of standalone tools that do Git for you, like SourceTree, but I recommend taking the time if you feel so inclined to learn how to do it from the command line, because then you'll actually have access to all the functionality and you'll get a better understanding of how it actually works. I mean, if you prefer SVN or Mercurial or CVS, that's fine. They all have their pros and cons. This is just a resource that I found was useful that I wanted to throw out there. Just basically Google Git manual and you'll find this website. I also want to talk briefly about design patterns. Design patterns is something that we didn't really go over very much at school. I think it might have changed a bit along in college in the years since I've graduated, but design patterns can also be very useful to know and understand. Design patterns arose from a group of programmers who started seeing common patterns that were reoccurring over and over again in software, and they basically categorized them and gave them names and explained how they work, their drawbacks, and they're a really good tool to have in your back pocket. And it's also very useful when to be able to talk in those terms because they're fairly common when you're dealing with other developers. But so another resource that I found for specifically to games is somebody Robert Nystrom wrote this book a few years back and put it up online for free. And you can buy a copy of it as well, but again, it's free online. It's a very accessible, very easy to read book that teaches you game pattern principles, and it's very easy to take that and apply to your games and generally architecture your stuff a little better. So again, that's the website, but if you just Google game programming patterns, it'll come up. So specifically, I went to university and college. It's definitely a different path than Mike's. And I have a few pieces of advice if you do decide to follow that. I kind of touched on one already. Make sure that it's for you before you do it. It's not necessary, but it can be useful. I decided it would be useful for me because I want to I guess I wanted that piece of paper. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that piece of paper can open doors for you when you're putting in a resume somewhere. It just shows that you completed something. That's something I firmly believe for years and years and years. Is the one thing that any diploma will show an employer is that you're able to dedicate yourself to something and complete it in 3 to 4 years. Is it useful? Yes. Is it necessary? Absolutely not. Mike's a perfect example of that. There's a lot of developers who teach themselves, and school isn't necessary. This is the gist of it. But that's not the core of what I wanted to talk about. What I really want to hammer home is if you do go to college, don't make the mistake of assuming that you'll learn everything you need to know there. You won't learn everything there. You need to continuously be teaching yourself. It's important because school is going to be very, very fixed, very, very specific. You're going to have a lot of stuff that isn't particularly useful. I mean, the intentions are good, but sometimes it's impossible to execute perfectly. There's just so much to learn, especially when you're talking about games. It's multidisciplinary. It's almost impossible to fit everything into one bundle of 3 or 4 years and say that now you're a game developer. It's really up to you to take what you learn, supplement it, keep teaching yourself, go after the things that you find interesting, and execute on them. The next piece of advice that I would give is that, I went to Algonquin College. It's a 3-year program. But what I found is time really flew very quickly. I was at the very beginning of this program, and I was like, oh man, 3 years is going to take forever. But it goes by very, very quickly. It goes by very, very quickly for a number of reasons. Just time generally goes by faster than we let ourselves believe it does. And if you're having fun, it goes by a lot faster too. And so that's something to keep in mind. If you do decide to pursue an education, college or university or whatever, make sure you make the most of it and enjoy it. Because for those 3 or 4 years that you're there, that's really your focus. That's what you're doing. You should be focusing on your craft, focusing on learning as much as you can, and focusing on having a good time and just enjoying it. It's behind me now, but I do miss it already. So I encourage you to do that. So I guess a few closing remarks. I mean, this whole talk is about trying to give you some advice on how you can start from I want to make games to eventually landing a career in games. It's very important not to lose sight of. It basically echoes what I just said. The journey, right? It's not about making it and getting your first job and woohoo, I made it. I'm good to go now. It's about the process of getting there, regardless of what you end up pursuing in life. So make sure you take the time to really slow down and just enjoy it and take in what's going on. It's about late night cram sessions and trying to complete projects. It's about Sunday morning bacon pancakes when you're trying to get a sprint finished, and it's about the people that you meet along the way. This was the team that I was working with on Rubik's Uncubed, that first project where I got to start and finish the whole thing, And I was taken a few weeks before, unfortunately, Magmic had to part with the majority of its staff. But I look back on those times, and when I think about those times, I'm reminded of this over here. It's the journey. Just enjoy it, because things can change very quickly, and you can end up somewhere completely different. But that's all right. That's what life's all about. So that's pretty much it. That's me. That's my email. It's funny the weird pictures you'll find on your phone when you're looking for stuff for slides. So, so yeah. So if I think I did all right. Yeah, I got it. Cool. So.